The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and Corvin Marsh hadn't slept in two. He stood at his kitchen window at 4 a.m., watching the orange glow of a diesel engine idling at the edge of his property, the third time this week, and he finally understood that what was happening to him wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a strategy, and tonight he was going to end it. Corvin Marsh had moved to Pinefeld Hollow in late October, drawn by the quarter-acre lot, the silence, and the price, $247,000 for a house that would have cost twice that 40 minutes closer to the city. The neighborhood sat at the end of a long county road that curved through dense pine forest, and the houses were spaced far enough apart that you could stand on your porch and hear wind moving through the trees without a single human sound beneath it. He was 43 years old, recently divorced, and entirely done with noise. Pinefeld Hollow, he had decided, was exactly the kind of place where a man could put himself back together without anyone watching. He worked remotely as a systems analyst for a logistics firm in Cleveland, which meant his days were structured entirely around his own discipline. Meetings on a screen, reports sent by email, a schedule that belonged to him. He had no reason to leave the house most days, and in those first weeks of October, before the cold really set in, he spent his evenings walking the perimeter of his lot, learning the boundaries of the land he now owned. His eastern edge ran along a stand of pine trees that served as a natural windbreak. His western edge bordered the road, his northern edge met a shallow ditch that collected runoff in spring, and his southern edge, the back of his property, abutted a narrow gravel access lane that the county had built years ago to service a utility easement but had since essentially abandoned. That lane would become the center of everything. He didn't notice the sign until his third week there. It was posted on a wooden stake driven into the ground at the corner of the gravel lane, where it met the road at the south end of the neighborhood. The sign was white with blue lettering, professionally printed, and it read, Pinefeld Hollow Homeowners Association, Community Services Zone, Authorized Vehicles Only. Below that, in smaller text, violations subject to fine. Contact phhoaservices@gmail.com. Corvin had assumed, the way most people assume things they encounter with professional-looking signage, that the HOA was real. He had received no paperwork about it when he purchased the house. His real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Deborah, who wore too much perfume and talked too fast, had mentioned in passing that the neighborhood had some kind of loose association, but that it wasn't deed-restricted and had no legal authority over individual properties. Corvin had filed this information in the back of his mind and forgotten it, the way people forget things that don't yet feel relevant. The first truck came in November. It was a Saturday morning, and Corvin was drinking coffee at the kitchen table when he heard the sound of a heavy vehicle moving slowly along the gravel lane behind his house. He went to the back window and saw a white pickup, newer model, clean, with a magnetic sign on the door that read Pinefeld Hollow HOA, idling along the lane. A man was driving. Another man was in the passenger seat. They moved slowly, as if surveying something, and then they stopped directly behind Corvin's property, where his back fence line met the lane. The passenger got out, walked to the edge of the lane, looked at Corvin's yard, and then got back in the truck without doing anything. They drove away. Corvin thought nothing of it. 2 weeks later, the first dump happened. He woke on a Monday after a weekend snowstorm to find that the gravel lane behind his property was no longer just a lane. Overnight, someone had pushed a wall of snow, 4 feet high at minimum and running the entire length of his back fence, directly against his property line. The snow wasn't from his lot. It was dense, dirty, mixed with gravel and road grit, the kind of snow that comes off a plow blade. Someone had plowed the lane and pushed every bit of it sideways into his yard. His fence, a simple 3-rail wooden fence he'd installed himself the first week of November, proud of the straight lines he'd managed, was buried to the second rail. He stood at his back door in his coat and boots, staring at it. His first reaction was confusion. His second was irritation. His third, which arrived slowly as he walked the length of the wall and noticed that none of his neighbors' properties on either side had received any snow, was something colder and more focused. The snow had been deliberately pushed against his yard specifically, not the yard to the east, not the yard to the west. His. He sent an email to the address on the sign that afternoon. He kept it neutral. He explained that he was the new resident at 14 Pinefeld Lane, that he had discovered a significant amount of snow had been pushed against his property line, that he assumed it was an error, and that he would appreciate it if they could remove the material at their earliest convenience. He signed it with his name, his address, and his phone number. He received a reply within the hour. The email came from an address that matched the sign, HOA services@gmail.com, and it was written with the clipped authority of someone who had rehearsed this kind of response many times. It said, "Dear resident, thank you for your message. As a reminder, the gravel service lane adjacent to your property is designated as a community maintenance corridor. Snow management in this area is conducted in accordance with HOA community service protocols. Residents are reminded that their properties exist in proximity to shared-use infrastructure and that some incidental contact between maintenance operations and private property lines is to be expected. We appreciate your understanding. Pinefeld Hollow HOA Management. Corvin read it twice. Then he read it a third time, more slowly, parsing each sentence for anything that functioned as an actual explanation or an apology or a commitment to correct the problem. There was none. The email had been written to sound official while saying absolutely nothing, and whoever had written it was skilled at exactly that kind of hollowness. He replied asking for the name of the HOA management company, the HOA's state registration number, and the contact information for the board of directors. He received no response. He called the county clerk's office the next morning and asked about the Pinefeld Hollow Homeowners Association. The clerk put him on hold for 4 minutes, came back, and told him there was no registered HOA under that name in the county. He asked if it could be registered under a different structure, a nonprofit, an LLC. She checked both. Nothing. He hung up the phone and sat very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from the sudden and complete crystallization of a situation. There was no HOA. There had never been an HOA. The sign, the truck, the magnetic door placard, the email address, all of it was theater. Someone in this neighborhood had constructed the appearance of institutional authority and was using it to do things that had no institutional backing whatsoever. And the first thing they had chosen to do with that fake authority was push their snow into his yard. He wanted to know who. He wanted to know why. And he wanted, above everything else, to make absolutely certain it never happened again. His neighbor to the west was a woman named Glenda Firth, 61, retired, who kept bird feeders in her yard and wore the same oversized green parka every time Corvin saw her outside. He had spoken to her twice, once when he moved in, once when he'd borrowed her outdoor spigot wrench to winterize his hose bib, and both conversations had been brief and pleasant. He knocked on her door that afternoon. Glenda answered quickly, as if she'd seen him coming. She invited him in for coffee without him having to ask, which told him she had been expecting a conversation like this one eventually. The HOA, he said, once he was seated at her kitchen table with a mug he didn't intend to drink from. Tell me about it. Glenda sat across from him and wrapped both hands around her own mug. She was quiet for a moment, the way someone is quiet when they're deciding how much of a truth to tell. Then she said, "It's Brent Polacek. He's been running it for about 6 years. Him and his brother-in-law, Nate Gruder. Brent lives 4 houses down, the brown colonial with the green shutters. Nate's on Sycamore, the next street over." "What does the HOA actually do?" Corvin asked. "It collects fees from people who don't know it's not real," Glenda said, "and it manages the snow removal contract for the lane." "Who gave them the lane?" "Nobody. The county stopped maintaining it about 8 years ago, and Brent just started claiming it. Put the sign up, wrote some paperwork that looks official but isn't, convinced people that paying the HOA was part of living here." She paused. "Some people figured it out and stopped paying. Most people just keep sending the check because it's easier." "How much?" $40 a month. Corvin did the math. There were roughly 20 houses in the immediate neighborhood. If even half of them were paying $40 a month to a fake HOA, Brent Polacek and Nate Gruder were collecting somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000 a year for doing nothing except pushing snow around and making threatening sounds. "Why my yard?" Corvin asked. "Why not someone else's?" Glenda looked at him with an expression that mixed sympathy with something that looked almost like guilt. "Because the house before you, the Tillmans, they paid the fee, every month, on time, for 4 years. When they left, Brent assumed whoever bought the place would pay too. And when he sent you the first welcome letter and you didn't respond." She stopped. "I never received a welcome letter," Corvin said. "He sent it to the email address on file with the listing. The Tillmans email. You never got it, and when you didn't pay, he decided you were a problem." She looked down at her mug. "The snow thing, that's what he does to people who don't pay. He doesn't do it to everyone, just the ones he thinks won't push back." Corvin nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand the full architecture of what Brent Polacek had built, not just the fake authority, but the behavioral system beneath it. The snow was a message. It was designed to be annoying enough to motivate compliance, but deniable enough to avoid consequences. It was the kind of pressure a certain kind of person applies when they've spent years operating in a gray zone and have learned exactly how far they can push without triggering a response that costs them anything. He thanked Glenda, finished enough of his coffee to be polite, and walked back across the snow to his own house. He did not feel angry, exactly. He felt something more useful than anger, a steady, architectural interest in exactly how this was going to end. He spent the next 4 days doing research. He found that operating a fake homeowners association and collecting fees under false pretenses met the threshold for several violations under state consumer protection law, potentially including fraud. He found the county's records on the utility easement. The lane was a county easement, which meant Brent Polachek had no legal right to manage it, modify it, or use it as a snow storage corridor for his plow operation. He found that the magnetic signs on the truck were not registered to any business entity and that the email domain had been created 18 months ago. He documented everything in a folder on his desktop, organized by category and date. He also ordered 4 game cameras, the kind used by hunters, and installed them at the corners of his back fence line, angled to capture the full width of the lane and the approaches from both directions. He positioned them inside his fence line, aimed outward, so they were legally capturing only activity that occurred in the lane and at his fence. He set them to record continuously on motion detection and to back up footage to a cloud drive every 6 hours. He did not contact Brent Polachek. He did not call the police. He did not post anything online. He simply waited, documented, and thought carefully about what leverage looked like in a situation constructed almost entirely from the other side's confidence that no one was paying close enough attention. December arrived with a second storm, and with it, confirmation of everything Glenda had told him. On a Thursday night, Corvin watched from his back window as a truck, the same white pickup, same magnetic sign, moved slowly down the lane behind his house. The plow blade was down, and as he watched, it pushed an enormous wall of snow directly against his fence line with a single, efficient pass, then reversed, pushed again, and drove away. The whole operation took less than 4 minutes. Whoever was driving had done it many times before. They were efficient, practiced, and entirely certain that nothing would come of it. Corvin went to his computer and pulled up the cloud footage from the cameras. The resolution was excellent. The truck's license plate was readable in 3 separate frames. The face of the driver, visible through the windshield as the truck turned at the end of the lane, was clear enough to identify. The driver was a younger man Corvin didn't recognize, which meant Polachek was using someone else, an employee, maybe, or the brother-in-law, Nate, to do the actual plowing. He saved the footage to a separate drive and printed 6 screenshots. By mid-December, Corvin had received 2 emails from HOA services igmail.com, one informing him that his HOA service fees were past due in the amount of $120 covering the 3 months since he'd moved in, and one informing him that failure to pay would result in additional community maintenance charges being assessed against his property. He did not respond to either. The third storm hit on December 19th. It was the worst one yet, 18 inches over 36 hours, the kind of storm that shuts down schools and clears grocery stores. Corvin spent 2 days shoveling his own driveway and walks, listening to the wind, drinking coffee, and thinking. By the time the storm passed, his back fence was invisible beneath a wall of snow that had been pushed against it so aggressively that 2 of the fence rails had cracked. He found the damage on the morning of December 21st, when the clouds cleared and the sun came out and turned the yard into a blinding white field. He stood at the broken fence and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the lane. The lane was a single-entry, single-exit corridor. It entered from the main road at the south end of the neighborhood, ran for approximately 400 feet along the back property lines, and terminated in a small turnaround circle at the northern end. A circle surrounded on 3 sides by a solid pine tree buffer and accessible only by the way it came in. The lane was not connected to any other road. It was, in architectural terms, a dead end with a loop. Corvin Marsh looked at that geometry for a very long time, and then he went back inside, made fresh coffee, and began making phone calls. The first call was to the County Public Works Office, where he asked about the utility easement on the lane, specifically whether any private entity had the right to modify, use for storage, or operate commercial vehicles on it without a county permit. He was told that no, the easement was for utility access only, that no permit had been issued to any private individual or company for commercial snow removal operations on the lane, and that any unauthorized commercial use of the easement was a violation subject to citation. He asked if the county would respond to a formal complaint. He was told yes, with documentation. The second call was to a civil attorney named Rosalind Venn, whose name he'd found on a local bar association website. He explained the situation in full, the fake HOA, the fee collection, the snow dumping, the property damage to his fence. Rosalind listened without interrupting, and then asked him to email her the documentation. He sent it that afternoon. She called him back 2 hours later. "This is actually a fairly clean case," she said. "You've got fraud, the fee collection under a false organizational identity. You've got trespass and property damage, the fence. You've got unauthorized commercial use of a county easement. And if any of the other neighbors have paid fees, you may have the basis for a class action." "I want to think about timing," Corvin said. "I don't want to move too early." "What are you waiting for?" she asked. "The right moment," he said, "and a few more inches of snow." Rosalind was quiet for a beat. "You're building something," she said. "I'm building a barrier," he said, "but I need them to drive into it first." He spent the next week talking to neighbors. Not all of them, just the ones Glenda had quietly identified as people who'd figured out the HOA was fake or who'd been pressured in ways that left them resentful. He found 6 households willing to share their experiences on record. 2 of them had paid fees for over 2 years before realizing there was no legal structure behind the demands. One of them, a retired postal worker named Dwight Acosta, who lived at the north end of the lane, had been told his refuse-to-comply status would result in his property being reported to the county health department for code violations. The threat was entirely fabricated, but Dwight had spent 3 weeks convinced he was about to receive a government citation before a friend set him straight. Corvin collected written statements from all 6 neighbors. He added them to his folder. The folder was now 43 pages long. On December 28th, he called the County Public Works Office again and formally filed a complaint about unauthorized commercial use of the easement, including the license plate number from his camera footage and the dates and times of the documented plow operations. He was given a complaint number and told the county would send an inspector within 10 business days. On December 29th, he called Rosalind Venn and told her to begin drafting a demand letter to Brent Polacek and, if identifiable, Nathan Gruder. Then he waited for snow. The forecast for New Year's Eve was grim. A front moving down from Canada, projected to deliver between 20 and 28 inches over a 48-hour period beginning December 31st. The meteorologists were calling it the biggest storm of the decade for the region. Schools had already preemptively canceled for January 2nd. The grocery stores were sold out of bread and batteries by the 29th. Corvin spent the 30th making preparations of a very specific kind. He rented a small skid steer from an equipment company 20 miles east, cash payment, personal rental, his own property, and had it delivered that afternoon. He spent several hours practicing with it in his side yard, learning the controls, getting comfortable with the blade. He was not particularly experienced with heavy equipment, but the skid steer was forgiving and the controls were intuitive, and by evening he could move it confidently. He also made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dwight Acosta, whose property sat at the north end of the lane near the turnaround circle. Dwight agreed, without much elaboration being necessary, to let Corvin do whatever he needed to do on the northern 20 feet of the lane, which abutted Dwight's property. "Do what you have to do," Dwight said. "I've been waiting for somebody to do something for 3 years. The second call was to Glenda, who simply said, "Good," when Corvin explained what he was planning and offered to make sure her outdoor cameras, which she had installed after a porch package theft the previous spring, were aimed at the lane for the duration of the storm. The storm arrived on New Year's Eve, exactly as predicted. By midnight, 14 inches had fallen. By 4 a.m. on New Year's Day, it was 21. Corvin was awake, dressed, and ready before dawn. At 5 a.m., in darkness, he drove the skid steer out of his yard through his back gate, the gate he had quietly installed in his fence the previous week, wide enough for the machine, and into the lane. He worked methodically, moving back and forth across the northern end of the lane near the turnaround circle, using the blade to push snow into a specific geometry. Not just a pile, a wall. He built it in layers, compacting each layer by driving over it before adding the next, the way you'd build an earthwork fortification. He mixed in water from a garden hose he'd run from Dwight's outdoor spigot, which Dwight had insisted on leaving functional for exactly this purpose. The water soaked into the packed snow and began, in the sub-zero temperature, to do what water does. It froze. By 7 a.m., the northern end of the lane was blocked by a wall of packed, partially frozen snow and ice that stood approximately 6 feet high and ran the full width of the lane. The turnaround circle was on the other side of it. Anyone who drove into the lane from the south would be able to reach the turnaround, but they would not be able to exit past the wall without equipment of their own. And the wall was on Corvin's side of the property line, built using snow that the county inspector would later confirm had originated from previous unauthorized plow operations on the easement. He drove the skid steer back into his yard, closed the gate, and went inside. He showered, made coffee, and sat down at his kitchen table to wait. The truck arrived at 9:14 a.m. Corvin watched on his phone. The cameras were streaming live. As the white pickup with the magnetic HOA signs turned off the main road and entered the lane from the south, it moved at normal speed, confident and practiced, the plow blade down, pushing the new storm snow to the sides in the familiar pattern. It reached the turnaround circle, began its turn, completed the loop, and stopped. The driver got out. Corvin watched him walk to the wall, touch it, push against it, walk back to the truck. He could see from the camera angle that the man was making a phone call. He stayed on the phone for approximately 2 minutes, then got back in the truck and turned it around in the circle, heading back toward the lane exit, where he found that the lane was no longer navigable. Because while he had been building the wall at the north end, the snow had continued to fall, and it was still falling, hard and sideways in the wind. And the lane behind the truck was now buried under fresh accumulation on top of the original plow ridges, making the surface soft and uneven. The truck, which was a half-ton pickup with a front plow blade, was not designed for the kind of high-centered, side-loaded extraction it was now attempting. On the first try, the back wheels spun. On the second, the truck lurched sideways and dropped its passenger side rear wheel into the drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of the lane. The truck was stuck. Corvin set down his coffee cup, stood up, put on his coat and boots, and walked out his back gate into the lane. The driver was standing beside the truck, staring at the rear wheel in the ditch, holding his phone. He was young, mid-20s, Corvin guessed, wearing a Carhartt jacket and a knit cap. He looked up when he heard Corvin's boots on the snow. "You the owner of this truck?" Corvin asked. "I'm the driver," the young man said, with a wariness that suggested he understood on some level that the situation was not simply mechanical. "Who do you work for?" The young man hesitated. "Polachek Property Services." "Not the HOA?" Another hesitation. "It's the same thing. Brent Polachek. He runs both." Corvin nodded. He took out his phone and made a call to the county non-emergency line. He explained that there was a vehicle stuck in the public utility easement behind his property, that the vehicle appeared to have been engaged in unauthorized commercial operations on the easement, and that he was providing the license plate number and the name of the operating entity. He gave the complaint number he had already been assigned. He was told a deputy would be sent to document the scene. He hung up and looked at the young man, who was watching him with the expression of someone who has just understood that they've been sent into a situation by someone who did not prepare them for what they would find. "You should probably call Brent," Corvin said, not unkindly. "He's going to need to know what's happening here." The young man called Brent Polachek. Corvin watched him relay the situation, watched his